and thanks for joining us. Today, what is ministry and leadership effectiveness? And what blind spots do we have? Valerie, Ling and Sarah Hindle are my guests. As the COVID-19 pandemic has continued, the morale and mental health of communities has been impacted. Faith communities have been instrumental in providing hope, comfort and pastoral care. However, many church leaders are exhausted. Prior to COVID, the figure in the US was that up to 38% of pastors have thought about quitting full-time ministry in the last year, and it's suggested that attrition rates are commonly linked to misalignment between what the congregation might expect of a leader and what the leader believes that they should be doing. The congregation has one view about ministry effectiveness and the pastor has a different view. Valerie, Ling and Sarah Hindle are with us. They're with the Centre for Effective Serving in Sydney. Valerie, let's start with you and a hard question, because you were telling me on the phone the other day a brutal truth that we, that's me, us pastor type people, are not as good leaders as we might like to think we are.
That's probably true of all leaders, I would say. Human beings aren't that great at estimating how they're doing without feedback, without input, without support. So sometimes we may overestimate how we're doing and sometimes we may underestimate how we're doing. Both cases means that we probably aren't heading in the direction that helps our followers to follow us or helps us to lead the way that is effective.
How do we as senior pastors particularly get it wrong?
So the little that I've looked at, and because there's not a lot that has been done in this area, suggests that when it comes to clergy, levels of self-awareness and emotional awareness aren't always at optimal levels. And that can lead to, so initially...
So we're emotional klutzes.
I wouldn't say you're an emotional klutz per se, but what tends to happen is that we probably react and make decisions and think about things from up here. And sometimes here gets divided or divorced from what's going on up here. And there are different reasons for why that happens. And Sarah and my team, originally the Centre for Effective Living, which is our mental health hub, are now developing training courses for us to help ministers, I guess, to figure out that disconnect.
What have you found there, Sarah?
Well, I guess my observations would be of, say, clergy, ministry workers who come into the centre and perhaps are experiencing burnout or difficulty in leadership spaces. So much more sort of clinical observations than Valerie's leadership lens, but oftentimes we'll notice sort of cyclical patterns of burnout or I guess personality issues that lead pastors to lead in a certain way. Maybe some coping modes, maybe the presence of some vulnerabilities that they've carried with them over the lifetime. And they really do manifest in the leadership space. And when
you're the leader you can't hide, you mean? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it may be that they're not particularly aware of them themselves, and there's often great value in sitting with a therapist who'll look at the developmental trajectory, sort of the presence of unmet needs in childhood that come up in leadership spaces, in relational spaces, in their relationship with God as well. And certainly coping modes, and I've seen a lot of that over this protracted COVID period that we've all gone through. And I think that anything that's sitting there in terms of a vulnerability has had a lot of opportunity and potential to come out in recent times.
So tell us about some of those conversations and particularly some of the more common patterns.
Well, common patterns, I guess, for coping in times of chronic stress would be sort of two main ways that it would manifest. One would be a detaching sort of coping style where perhaps when times are tough, someone might go to, excessive use of screens or perhaps alcohol or drugs or, pornography in some cases, but ways that we can not experience the full sense of distress, ways to get us through that moment. And then conversely, I guess the other style would be an approach style where we move into control, where we move into sort of highly manage a situation, maybe micromanage, perhaps overcompensate, perhaps also too we might overwork, so excessive working. Reassurance seeking is another sort of approach strategy if we're feeling like quite uncertain, and also over researching, all ways to reduce uncertainty that we experience in life.
Over researching?
Yeah, so for people with anxiety, oftentimes they will research excessively before making a decision. They just won't feel like they have, what it takes to make a good decision on their own.
You were telling me before, Valerie, about congregational expectations versus leader expectations and leaders and followership. Can I just unpack that with you for a moment?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the stresses that Sarah spoke about that pushes into that space where a minister may actually feel like they're not coping. So I took 12 months to study leadership, essentially because I was noticing that that was coming up quite a lot in working with senior ministers. And I discovered that you can't have leadership without followership. Very often we think of leadership issues as resting with the individual, the leader. And what I actually discovered is that leadership issues are highly intertwined with the relationship that you have with your followers. So how followers view what a church leader is meant to do and how a church leader views what they're meant to do very often aren't aligned. And therefore, what happens are expectations that are heading in a different direction. So leadership is the act of influence to help a group of people to get from point A to point B by heading in the same direction towards the same goal. When followers have a different view of what that goal is or what that should be, then that makes it very stressful on the relationship.
That's going to happen, though, in a church, isn't it? Where everybody's a volunteer and everybody can decide what they want to do and,
Absolutely. So when we actually look at, in general, what leadership and followership is, followership requires a high degree of trust, a high degree of a willingness to be led, high degrees of openness as well, but it also requires the leader to have high levels of moral integrity, transparency, the competencies come in, the ability to communicate and convey the vision and the direction. And put those two things when you're saying it's misaligned because we've got a variety of people in church followership. The engine for that, unfortunately, is adversity and conflict. It is in that space that we forge understanding. Are we good at that, Dominic? Very often Christians aren't. We're just not great at that.
So how do we get better?
Self-awareness is really critical, emotional awareness and self-awareness. I suppose that's why as psychologists we enter this space to say that there's a lot that you can learn, but there's more that you'll have to experience first. Being comfortable with vulnerability and actually saying, I'm not okay. I think I am feeling stressed. I need to figure out what's underneath that. And for followers and churches to understand that sometimes that's going to take time, that's going to take a lot of mistakes for the leader as well. It's very costly for church leaders to actually say, I don't have the answer, I don't know. That doesn't necessarily mean they're ineffective. It just means that in the marriage of church leadership and followership, it requires a mutual grace and patience to walk that journey. That makes sense.
I don't think I like announcing I don't know the answer to something.
I
like to have solved the problem in my mind before other people realise it's a problem.
Well, the master's program that I went through was painful for that reason. I don't even think I realised that I would have to submit myself to that process. One of the very first things I had to do cold turkey was to send my team, as part of my assignment, questionnaires for feedback on my leadership.
How did she do? No.
I'm sure that would have been awkward for you to receive as well.
I found it authentic. Yeah.
That statistic I quoted at the beginning, 38% of pastors in America have thought about quitting in the last 12 months. I mean, obviously, you're only dealing with a small sample space and all those kind of things, but does that feel ballpark right to you?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really tough gig. Being a senior clergy person or a minister in that position of responsibility. As Valerie's mentioned a couple of times now, this component of self-awareness, I think, is kind of a gateway for being able to develop the kind of resilience through insight to make good and healthy choices about our own capacities and to be able to keep going in that space over the long term is definitely an essential component of long-term ministry.
It does feel like it's changed. I mean, if we just think back 20 years, it has changed so much. You know, nobody taught you how to do anything. I mean, you just had to teach the Bible and
absolutely,
that was it, really.
Yeah.
You know, work out a music roster. You know, how has it got more complex, Valerie?
So this is a really hard one to answer because every church will have the answer. So I'm sure if you reflect on the story of your church, the different leadership narratives it's had, the different experiences of leadership it's had, every church will have its unique story, if you like, to unpack. In general,
I guess every church is also going to have its own story of organisational dysfunction.
Correct, absolutely. I don't know that we spend enough time in that space really understanding the story and the history of the narrative, you know, because if you've had people in your church for, 30, 40 years versus someone who's been in the church for 3 years or 3 months, the concept is called implicit leadership and implicit followership. Their view of what is effective is different. And so we definitely find that there are very loose definitions of ministry effectiveness and leadership effectiveness. There's not a lot of agreement, right? So
between the members and the minister.
Yeah, and even between leaders, even between church leaders. So why is it a tricky one to answer? Because under the banner of church leadership, you've got leadership as we know it in the commercial space, which is being able to chart a direction for an organization where there are different layers of leadership, if you like, right? And then you've got the management stuff as well. That's the actual doing, the operations. That's become highly complex in the last 20 years.
Your staff, your team have actually done the things that they were asked to do.
Well, and a little bit higher than that is your governance. You've got work compliance, work health safety issues, the COVID safety issues, all that, the government places on you as well. So you've got compliance issues as well. You're probably dealing with more complex finance structures as well. So you've got the management aspect of it. Then you've got the administration level. Now, I know sometimes, pastors can say to one another, you should delegate more. But what if you don't have anybody to delegate to? What if the narrative in your particular church is one where the minister did it all? That's a change management process in and of itself. And then you've got the pastoral leadership element, right, which I think for a lot of this, that's where we start. We start with the hope that when we come to church, we will get comfort. We will find a place that we can rest our burdens. With a church of a certain size, it's very difficult to get all of those things met in one human being. So it does make it difficult.
Different members are going to want different things from their pastor. And, I mean, I always think the people here, I mean, this is me projecting onto our congregation, but I think they think that I work too hard, but I think they think, I wish Dominic would spend more time here, or more time here, or more time here, or more time here, but they're all different more times in all the different places. Since you're giving me this analysis and I'm sitting here on the couch.
Dominic, I think it's a relationship change that is a grief for both parties. I think that needs to be said. It's a grief for the leader, the more they've got to move into those leadership spaces, and it's also a grief for the congregation. I guess the thing is we don't talk a lot about that. So you're right. The little bit that I've read would suggest that if you have an older congregation, pastoral care is the thing that they're looking for, the visit, the phone call, the kind touch. If you go up then to the younger generation, they may be looking for someone who's more aware of the social justice issues. You know, going out of the church building, engaging with the political landscape out there, and then somewhere in the middle are those of us who have kids and, you know, really hoping that church would be a place where your kids feel safe. And so it's so diverse. The thing is, we don't talk really about how we see church. I was saying to Josh before, my husband, before I came out, I said the part of the difficulty, because when I was studying leadership, is if you are a products-based organization, right? And let's say you believe that the car that you're inventing will solve all the pollution issues in the world, right? People self-select that vision, and you select into that vision people who will come on board. A world without pollution from cars, right? That's your point B. You're at point A, now you're going to get to point B. Everybody can see the car. So the competency of the leader is to say, look at the car, see how it's going to change the world, paints that vision, sets the milestones, right? And off we go. When there's conflict and all of that, you say, well, if we're not aligned, goodbye. Or if you can't do the job, goodbye. Church is a really different entity altogether. Yes, we know it's heaven-bound. Yes, we know spread the gospel and the news to all those who don't know him. But what that looks like in my head, in Sarah's head, in your head, probably looks very different. And here's the thing. It's not very nice to throw people out of church either. You can't do that. So lots of conflict. And then you have the question then, so what do we do about that? And that's where, you know, we come back to this piece of saying, when we're more aware and patient and gracious with one another, and we actually realize that when we're all under stress, and we also passionately want to see a world with Jesus, we're pushing on some passion buttons that will bring up some of the things that Sarah said. You know, we might withdraw, we might compensate, we might overwork. And that's not because we're weak or we're poor leaders. It's just we need more space to dialogue and become more aware of these things.
I'm imagining, Sarah, in your conversations, it's actually, for many people, it's conflict that means that they end up in your office. Is that right?
Yeah, true. Like there can be a total sort of, as Valerie was saying, a clash of mindsets about what leadership is. Team dynamics are often the reason that people will come in. Sometimes there can be injuries inflicted by other Christians on Christians. And
I mean, then physical injuries or?
So psychological injuries, so sort of trauma experiences.
So give me an example.
Many examples, but just generically speaking, if somebody's needs for, say, autonomy and safety, which are foundational needs that we carry with us over the lifetime, are compromised or challenged in, say, a team environment, that can actually create a real difficulty for a person to be able to manoeuvre and take care of their own emotional needs. So if that's kind of stopped or called into question, then that can be, sustain a psychological. It's like a stress reaction that people can have in those sorts of situations.
Now, you've just been working on a course for ministers who, I guess, are in a muddle. That's a technical term I thought I'd share with you. And you kind of gave me a couple of the bullet points a moment ago of things you kind of move into. Could you just dig down into those a little more?
Yeah, so the course that we've been putting together as a team is a schema-informed course, and schema therapy.
What does that mean?
Yes, schema therapy is actually a wonderful modality to work with one-on-one with clients, because it really has a beautiful sort of attachment lens. It looks at, perhaps what vulnerabilities might actually exist from childhood over the lifetime. And certainly it's my experience that many sort of pastors aren't particularly aware that they even have needs. So a healthy dose of psychoeducation there in terms of well-being and what we need to feel well, psychological needs being just as important as physical needs. Also too, it shines a real spotlight on coping styles. So coping styles might show up when, say, needs are not met, and then we've learnt to get along in life. We've learnt to cope, we've learnt to adapt.
So you talked about some of the unhealthy ones a moment ago, about, what did you say, pornography, you said?
Yeah, so that's like a self-soothing coping mode. It detaches us from, say, distress or uncomfortable emotion. And over time, if we over-rely on those unhealthy coping modes, we don't have a full sense of our relationships. We can have sort of flat emotional experiences, a lack of joy, a lack of sort of a full sense of relationship with other people, and certainly it impacts on our relationship with God as well.
So what do I do if I'm in that difficult position?
What do you do? Well, bringing it back to self-awareness, I think being aware of, say, ways that we engage with difficulty. What are our responses to stress? What are our responses to our internal experiences, our emotional experiences? And also to, perhaps what vulnerabilities are we carrying with us and compensating for, and just working with. They would be indications that maybe it's time to stop and reflect and have a look at what is underlying some of those, unhelpful ways that we get along in life.
Relational blind spots?
I think building on what Sarah was saying, we need to get better at being, I think for ministers, at being vulnerable. So when we meet up with one another, so let's peg it there. It's not just about talking shop, what we're doing, not just problem solving and troubleshooting either, how we're going to do the service. We really need to find a safe space and get comfortable with that, and finding the right people to actually say, I'm not doing so well. For people to inquire about our holiness and our purity and our spiritual walk, and how we're going at home with family. What are some of the things that we don't know more than what we know? So I would say we need to start there, because the more we do that, the more we start to become aware about really those blind spots within ourselves, right? When we get better at looking at and experiencing and knowing those blind spots, we actually get better at being empathic, curious and patient, and less reactive when we're interacting with people who feel like they're demanding things of us, or feel like they're not agreeing with us, or feel like they're resisting us. And we can sit a little bit longer in that space of going, what could be happening here? Beyond the, I don't really like what you said on Sunday, what could be happening here? What's that pushing on my buttons when they say that? What could be happening for this person in their broader world? Is it really a pastoral conversation that's required underneath all of that? Or maybe we've had a bit of a rupture somewhere along the line that I'm just not aware of, right? So it's being able to press pause. We like to say that at our practice. We often say, let's just press pause, or let's just sit on this one, shall we? And let's book a date to come back. And when we do that, that means that, let's say if it was Sarah or myself, we need to go into that space of asking those questions and then coming into the conversation with curiosity to say, when you actually gave me that feedback, can we just unpack that a little bit? What did that feel like for you? All of this, Dominic, requires skill and practice. If you haven't had practice doing that in your everyday life, it's going to be really hard to do it with your congregation members. So hence, we're really big fans, I suppose, of getting into some kind of pastoral supervision or mentoring or therapy if you're really not coping, or even a peer-to-peer interactions where you're asking those level of questions beyond just the doing questions. It's really getting into the pastor's heart.
So you want us as staff teams to be pushing into those questions with each other?
Well, I think that's the ideal. but it can take a long time because you need to establish trust and safety. You first need to know where your levels of trust and safety are. So in our business at the moment, we have a space called People Matters. I just introduced it this year. And basically I said to my team, before I give you feedback, you need to be comfortable giving me feedback. And then I need to find out from you, was that okay? Was that nerve-wracking? Do you feel intimidated? Do we need to do this differently? I've got to first embrace that question. Do you feel safe enough to tell me what you think and what you feel? And what do we need to do?
Are you doing that one-on-one with the staff member, or are you doing it in a group where they all sit around and say,
one-on-one. Yeah, it came really from my realization that even though I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, when they told me to give those questionnaires to the team, I was horrified. I really did not want to do it. And then I realized how much the team had to be gracious with me and how much they had to be patient with me in this process to say, all right, we will give you the feedback. But, you know, at first not everybody did. And now I guess I'm at the space where I realize that that is leadership. Leadership is actually being concerned enough to say, I need you to tell me how I'm doing. Let's figure out a way that we can do it in a safe way so that I win your trust and we work out a way that I'd be able to do the same with you. So it's hard work.
And you've done it with all, I mean, you've got quite a big team.
We're in the process.
Right.
Hopefully it goes okay, Sarah.
We've had plenty of those conversations and it's been fine.
Yeah, we have.
It's necessary.
And you do it one-on-one with your team, and you're saying, now what if you disagree with their feedback?
I don't know if you can, I don't know if you ever get to a point where you fully disagree. There's always something to inquire about. So in my early days, I probably reacted quite defensively because I was doing all the right things. You know, I was clinically and technically accurate in what I was doing, was providing feedback to correct people and things like that. I think when there's tension, it's often a signal that there's something in our relationship or something in our individual spaces that probably needs to be figured out. It might just be that that I'm stressed or you're stressed and things like that. Now, in my practice, I also have a term which I say non-negotiables. I do let the team know this is a non-negotiable. This means that I have some information about compliance or governance or some information I can't share with you because I can't tell you what's going on with clients or what's happening in the space. But in this non-negotiable space, I can hear what your reactions are to it and I can elicit what you need in that change management process, even though I can't change the decision. Right? So I'll need to alter timelines or alter the way we do it to respect where everybody is in leveling up to that non-negotiable. But that's often where we might get a disagreement. And I think the research in the leadership space shows that part of effective leadership and followership is getting to the point where we learn how to disagree, right? Where we say, I don't quite get what you're doing here. Here's my input. I trust that you will take that now and ponder upon it and then come back and give feedback and say, I thought about it. I'm not going to be able to do it this time, but let's park that there for next time or, right, we're going to have to chart this direction.
That was a very interesting scenario you just painted. I just wondered if you could give me one in a church like that.
Well, COVID's, I guess, a classic one. And, you know, I'm saying this also with trepidation and fear because, again, every church is a unique context. But COVID is a classic one. There's a lot of non-compliance and governance issues that were non-negotiables. And you had to take all the feedback. I think many church leaders took surveys and feedback to figure out where everybody was in that space. Sometimes maybe the speed of the decision and the level of the communication may not have matched where people were at, but that's classic decisions. So if you can't actually change those rules, you have to actually keep going back, listening to the conflict, figuring out and conveying this space is in that non-negotiable space, but here's a little piece of grass we can both stand on. Let's make this work. Right? What do we need to feel like we're still in it together?
I was just reflecting though. I mean, one of the complexities I found in leading through COVID was not wanting to just do what satisfied the most anxious member of the church. Because if we just pandered to the most anxious member of the church. Well, we were never going to open ever, you know. And so you actually did have to lead and then leave people to make their own risk assessments and their own adult decisions based on you having done safe things and that kind of thing. And so that was what I was thinking as you were speaking.
So I think in that scenario, it's how do the people in our church and in our congregation feel loved?
Yeah.
And sometimes it is that we may have to call that one person. I know we've got to delegate and all of that, right? But, you know, when we actually think about the pastor's heart, it is about looking at the weakest member in our congregation.
Yeah.
I remember in the practice, lockdown 1, we all gathered and I said, we must think about the weakest member in our community, in our clients, and act in one mind with that picture in mind. What does that person need of us? My role in that context was communication. I put newsletters out every week through MailChimp. I was on social media, I was on the videos, you know, just basically saying, we're thinking of you, we're thinking of you, right? So it comes down to that level of the weakest person in the midst of us. What do they need? How do they tangibly receive and feel that love? And there needs to be creativity and flexibility in that. And trust that when your leadership are going in a different direction, it doesn't mean that they've now turned into someone with deep characterological flaws. Those things exist, Dominic, right? Characterological flaws in senior ministers do exist, and we shouldn't excuse them. But people typically don't go into, you know, a narcissistic mode overnight. There are patterns, pervasive patterns, that happen in previous jobs, broken relationships, marriages, friendships. It comes with a history. Very often when you see that sort of a flip, it's from high stress, high pressure, and a high need to just gain control. Different from relational control, just needing to gain situational control so that I don't fail. I don't fail Jesus. I don't fail, you know, the people that He's given to me. So it's really important for us to think about these things in a way that's more relational and not formulaic and saying, oh, this is what's happening now.
So much more to talk about, but we've run out
I've gone into a tangent, Dominic. Did I go off course?
No, that was just great, but we've got to come to an end and we'll get you back to pick up on some more of these things. My guests on the... Thanks so much for coming in. My guests on the Pastor's Heart, Valerie, Ling and Sarah Hindle. They're with the Centre for Effective Serving, and we will look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon on the Pastor's Heart.